How surprised have you been by the comparatively poor performance of the Russian military in this campaign so far? And what are some of the key factors involved?
So, good morning. Genuinely surprised, and the Russian military have failed now to do three things. They failed at the outset in the way they constructed an operation that relied on light forces moving very quickly, going to take Kiev in 48 hours, and that was a complete misappreciation of the Ukrainian resistance and the reception they were getting in Ukraine. A failure of intelligence and understanding and planning. They then failed again when they realized that didn't work, and they reset their forces to much heavier forces. And we've seen 2 weeks now of generally approaching the cities, particularly Kiev, with the intent of mustering really large armored forces with a lot of firepower. And they have struggled to do that. They've struggled with their planning, their leadership, their logistics, their movement drills. And even now, they're just feeding in relatively small numbers of troops, sort of company about 100 or battalion about 800 size, which the Ukrainian resistance are managing to do quite well. And they've still failed to take control of the air in the way that they thought they would. And this is not the reputation that they brought to this fight. And they have descended from, if you like, in a sporting analogy, a Premier League reputation to third or fourth division.
Yeah, that's quite a list of mistakes. And like you, I've been struck by Russia's failure to achieve control of the air over Ukraine, particularly in view of their overwhelming superiority in numbers of aircraft. How have they failed to manage this, and how much of a blow has it been?
So I think we need to be cautious because they're capable of learning, but they've simply not shown that they've had the training to be able to produce air or ground forces that can operate at scale and at high tempo, and they've been constrained a bit on the ground by the roads and the mud either side of it. But, and this is a huge but, they're just as an organisation so much bigger, so much more potentially powerful than the Ukrainian military that even though they've had a poor month, they are perfectly capable now of assembling enough people and enough firepower, and then patiently, desperately, destructively grinding their way into Ukrainian cities. So we should really not think that this war is anywhere near concluded.
That's interesting that we shouldn't get carried away, you're saying, with the idea that the Ukrainians could hold out.
Yes, the Ukrainian resistance is phenomenal, but we should recognize that in a well-prepared defense, and they've constructed that, you should hold off forces that are 3 to 5 times bigger than you are. And the Ukrainians have the advantage of morale. They've been preparing for this for more than 7 years. They're being quite well supplied by NATO, and they know how to take on this lumbering Russian machine. But what they do not have is the ability to push the Russians out. They're just too big and too many of them. And as they are reduced by Russian artillery and air power, they're going to struggle to keep up the same sort of effectiveness that they've had so far.
So in light of that, what can and what should NATO be doing to support Ukraine as the war goes on?
So I think there are two dimensions to this. I think the first is in Ukraine, and we should admit our abject failure as an alliance in helping the Ukrainians to be able to deter and then, if necessary, defeat the Russian invasion that they've known has been coming since 2014. So the first thing we're going to have to do is look after the refugees, whether it's 5 or 6 million that come into the West, because we have some debt to them, I think, and for as long as it takes. The second thing we are going to do, I hope, is sustain the defense, and if the defense in some places become an insurgency, we'll sustain that. So there's no way that the Russian military in Ukraine will feel they're ever getting off this hook of trying to conduct an occupation by force, which is doomed to fail at any level other than abject destruction. And the third thing, and arguably strategically as important, will take longer, is we just have to reset this balance between NATO and Russia in terms of power. And we should frankly be ashamed that Russia, an economy the size of Spain, and 130 million people, a GDP of about $1.3 trillion, is somehow trying to dictate terms to us, the West, with a GDP just in the European Union of about 13 trillion before you add the UK and the United States, and theoretically 3.5 million people under arms. And this position where Russia is angry, aggressive and mobilized, and the West has been large and frankly asleep and demobilized, we need to correct that, because that is how we will stop this war from spreading and dictate terms to Russia for how the world works for the next couple of decades.
Yeah, I think you're far from alone in thinking that the West's political aims have been somewhat confused. And I think now it seems to me that there are sort of three camps that people fall into: those who think the West should seek a settlement in Ukraine with Russia, those who think it's more important to try and contain Russia, and those who think actually this is the moment that, it's been shown that the West needs to try and provoke a crisis that will lead to the demise of Putin. Where do you stand on that?
So I would characterize it slightly differently. So people have been saying, people who follow Russia, so analysts, policy experts, diplomats, military people like me, we've been saying for 10 years, Mr. Putin says he's at war with us. And you look at the way that he is organizing, improving his military and acting in the hybrid space. So those methods of confrontation short of the military instrument. He's been poking us for 10 years. And this is based on an irreconcilable, different narrative. And we have denied that. We've tried denial. We have essentially appeased it because we had other things to worry about, and we couldn't quite believe that he was going to do this kind of thing. And he clearly had that capacity. So now we've had this inflection point with Russia, and we're trying to reset the balance. And I think what we are now going to have to do is to reset our national and collective resilience. We're going to have to learn to do hybrid campaigning better and collectivize it with our partners. And we're going to have to reset our military so that Russia's ability to hold us in jeopardy is diminished. And there will be both nuclear and conventional aspects to this. And when we do this, we'll be doing it, yes, because of Ukraine, and we should be in awe of Ukraine and the price it's paying for our hubris, really. Yes, we're doing it because of Russia, but we should see Russia really as a sort of speed bump on the way to the greater challenges of the 21st century. And we have said all of this in our own government reviews, because we're going to have a difficult conversation with countries like China about how the world works in the 21st century. And the things we need to do to reset our balance of power with Russia are the things we'll need to do to have an honest conversation with China where at least we get a voice.
And you mentioned government reviews. There's been some criticism that the integrated review of last year, the big reset of foreign and defence policy in the UK, put too much emphasis on hybrid warfare. I think Liz Truss, the Foreign Secretary, is among those who've been most vocal, suggesting too much emphasis and cash has been given to cyber warfare, to space as a contested theatre. I wondered, do you agree with that? And overall, do you think that the defence budget needs to rise?
So I think the integrated review did two things quite well. It articulated the world I've described as much more challenging, uncertain, and dangerous 21st century. And it articulated quite well how you need a fusion of powers. So military, public sector, the things the government can do, and indeed private sector power. And let's not forget the most powerful weapon we're deploying now against Russia is all in the private sector, really. And then it did two things badly, in my view. It to save money in defence, it cut things quickly without articulating how we were going to grow effective armed forces in the future. And then that growth at the time was way, I mean, beyond 5 years away. So I thought there was a disconnect there. I think we are now clear that war in the 21st century is this full orchestra of, yes, of course, cyber and social media amplification as supporting acts, but nobody in Mariupol has been cybered to death so far. And then the full orchestra of 21st century military forces. So maritime, land, air, space, cyber, in the jargon, multi-domain operations. And we know that we are at the bottom of a trajectory there you can trace back to the end of the Cold War. So our forces have never been less ready in terms of size, training, and general readiness to take on this kind of problem. So we're going to have to transform them for the digital age. So that's not buying the stuff we wanted in the 1990s. It's buying the stuff that we want in the 2030s, but more quickly. And we know how to do that. And that's going to cost money. I reckon, given the limits of absorption that come with these things, at least 3% of GDP for 5 years starting now would start to fill in the holes and get us on the right path. And if our other allies, and look at the German example, do this, we'll be in a much better place quite quickly.
Well, 3% of GDP up from the current sort of spending level of 2.3% would mean billions extra spent on defence by the UK. We had Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, on the show earlier, and he gave a very strong signal that he isn't going to be raising it at the spring statement. Do you think it's something he needs to think again about?
So I do. I mean, I think there's a struggle amongst our policymakers and political leaders to recognise that they're already grappling with a whole array of problems: the pandemic, inflation, the shock that we're still managing from 2008, the drama of NHS spending, and all those kinds of things. But we're spending as taxpayers, we're spending about 800 odd billion pounds a year on our public sector, and we're just going to have to make some more difficult choices. But if we believe that we are now in a world which is far more threatening to our security, our prosperity, and our values, and we recognise that we're being held at disadvantage by only Russia, then I think we don't really have much of a choice, and it may take a bit of time. But I think we are going to have to spend more on our collective security, and look at the German example.
Mm-hmm. And just finally, I mean, one area in which the Russian military is asymmetric to the West is in its use of mercenaries. We're hearing a lot more now about mainly Russians, but also perhaps Syrians being brought into Ukraine to shore up the formal Russian advance. How concerned are you about that?
So we should recognise that they are dangerous, because these forces are in some cases well trained, in some cases not. But they're also unaccountable in that they will claim not to be part of the Russian armed forces, and therefore the chances of them behaving despicably are greater. I think in terms of their ability to have a significant effect on the size of the war we're seeing in Ukraine, it'll be quite marginal, and we should absolutely take it as a sign of how Russia is struggling with a campaign that went off the rails in the first 24 hours.
General Barrons, thank you.